get started. My name's Laurie Kavanaugh. I work here at Thayer Public Library. Welcome to everybody. We're excited to have Anthony Sammarco here tonight. He's a noted historian and an author of over 70 books on the history and development of Boston, and he lectures widely on the history of his native city. He's had many bestsellers, including Lost Boston, The History of Howard Johnson, How a Massachusetts Soda Fountain Became a Roadside Icon, Jordan Marsh, New England's Largest Store, and Christmas Traditions in Boston are just some of them. Tonight he'll present the history and the aftermath of the Great Boston Fire of 1872 in commemoration of the 150th anniversary of this devastating event. So please welcome Anthony Sammarco.
Thank you very much. Who has ever heard of the Great Boston Fire of 1872? A few of us. Well, 25 years ago, I wrote a book on the 125th anniversary, and I thought it was covering everything I needed to do. But over the last 25 years, I've collected not only ephemera and photographs and postcards and stereo views of the fire, but I also had a series of books that had wonderful reminiscences. So for the 150th, which was November 9th and 10th last week, this was something that I actually worked on over the winter, and it was published only recently and is available not only on Amazon but in major bookstores. And it says Inferno, the Great Boston Fire of 1872. Well, the cover is a detail of a Currier and Ives print that was done in 1873. It showed not just the fire, which was destroying 65 acres of downtown Boston, but we see in the distance the dome of the Massachusetts State House as well as the spires of many of the churches. But in the foreground were many of the excursion boats, sailboats, and rowboats that people would pay $1 to actually be rowed into the harbor as close as they could to watch the conflagration. Well, this is a book that's divided into 3 sections. The first part is before the fire. The second part is during the fire, and remember, there was no night photography, and this happened at 7 p.m. on a Saturday evening, November 9th, and the aftermath. So in many instances, this is something that talks about what was the old South End of Boston. Today we think of the South End as an area that's actually a completely built-up area of the 1840s and 50s. But the old South End was considered to be the epitome of urbane living in the early 19th century. Charles Bulfinch had introduced neoclassicism in the 1790s with the design of the Tontine Crescent on Franklin Place. In fact, Samuel Adams Drake, author of Old Landmarks and Historic Personages of Boston, said, "Summer Street was beyond dispute the most beautiful avenue in Boston, shaded by a grove in a light softened by the leafy screen and over the shadows of the big elms lying across the pavement. Seen here is Summer Street, with Bedford Street and Summer Street on either side of the octagonal church. It was a residential neighborhood at this point, which is about 1825. But the residential quality of the neighborhood around Summer Street is evident by this photograph of the early 1860s, with a corner of the portico of the octagonal church on the right and row houses on the left along Bedford Street leading to Chauncey Street. The wide expanse of the open square in the foreground, paved in cobblestones, created an impressive approach to the church and has long been known as Church Green. Well, the old South End. In the mid-19th century, Boston was undergoing major changes through the topographical infilling of the new South End on either side of the neck of Boston, or Washington Street in the South End, the massive infilling of the Back Bay marshes, as well as the increase in population by matriculation and immigration. And following the Civil War, Boston was to see its population increase to 250,000 by 1870, of which one half was either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And the city was embracing change, ethnic as well as religious, and was a far cry from the homogeneous town settled by the Puritans from England in 1630. By 1872, much of the former residential neighborhood known as the Old South End had given way to commerce. Summer, Bedford, Kingston, Arch, Franklin, and Federal Streets, and others had once been the pride of the Athens of America, but by the 1860s, most of its residents had moved to the newly filled South End, the Back Bay, and the suburbs. And the area was rebuilt with impressive 5-story commercial blocks that not only changed the face of Boston, but were architecturally impressive with their splendid fronts that became the pride of Victorian Boston, its merchants, and the Bostonians who now thronged to the area. The type of houses that would be built in this area since the mid-18th century were on Summer Street, which had been one of the more fashionable residential areas of Boston. This duplex, red brick, Greek Revival row house was designed by Asher Benjamin for Richard Tucker and James Page. It faced Church Green and was indicative of the well-designed houses built in the 1830s. And as the neighborhood changed and became less desirable as a place of residence, this duplex house was demolished in 1865, 35 years after it was built. When seen here, Franklin Street in Boston was originally laid out in the 1790s by Charles Bulfinch and included row houses on both sides of an elliptical curve. Known as the Tontine Crescent, this was an upscale neighborhood in the first half of the 19th century, but by the 1850s, the city was expanding commercially. The row houses were demolished, but the gentle elliptical arc of Bulfinch's Tontine Crescent was maintained, with the rebuilding of the new commercial blocks in 1859. And looking towards Federal Street, with Arch Street on the right, the 4- and 5-story buildings commanded the streetscape and were the pride and joy of the city. In fact, the Cathedral building, which was designed by Joseph Billings and built on the site of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross prior to moving to the South End, a Roman Catholic church designed by Charles Bulfinch and built in 1803 at Franklin and Devonshire Streets. It was established by Jean Lefebvre de Chevreuse, the first Catholic bishop of Boston, and when Pope Pius VII created the Diocese of Boston, the church was elevated to a cathedral. The last Mass was said in 1860, and the church was demolished in 1862. Patrick Donahue bought the land and had the impressive cathedral building built, and this was where the Boston Pilot, which he owned, was printed. There was also the Beebe Block, an impressive 5-story commercial block with a mansard roof that was built at Devonshire and Otis Street at Winthrop Square. Built in 1861, the block was named for owner James Madison Beebe, a successful dry goods merchant. And the store carried on an enormous trade in dry goods with all parts of the country, and the largest jobber of dry goods in New England. Oh, this was basically Boston. But the problem was, in November of 1872, there was an epizootic in Boston. This was something that was devastating. In the fall of 1872, Boston was in the throes of an equine influenza that affected horses, most of whom began to show symptoms, such as a cough and general sluggishness. The disease was said to have emanated from Canada, and within weeks the symptoms had become prevalent in major cities. Horses showed a series of common symptoms, including discharges from the nostrils and eyes, a rasping cough, general exhaustion, and an inability to work. These symptoms and the images of sick horses were so ubiquitous, they became the subject of satire, as in an etching of an ill horse called a Cheval Rouse patient, which appeared in Harper's Weekly. However, this was a serious situation, as the impact on Boston by the affected horses was devastating, especially as horses were vital in not just pulling carriages and carts, but also the delivery of goods, food, and supplies. The result was that manpower was necessary, and it extended to the transportation of fire engines, if needed at a fire. With most of the horses in cities suffering with the equine flu, the Detroit Free Press said on October 26th of 1872 that horses worsened with a dry and hacking cough, moving with reluctance and general dullness, nasal membranes at first pale, watery discharge from one or both nostrils, ears and legs cold. And seen here a family ruined at the advent of winter. The family horse is lying on a bale of hay, and we realize that this was something that was part of the livelihood of many people. And it was something in some ways that was unexplainable. In some ways, people realized if they didn't actually have manpower, the city was going to shut down. There was an epizootic, as I said, in the fall of 1872, and it did affect all the horses of Boston. It was devastating, especially as horses were important in not just pulling carriages and push carts, but also the streetcars that crisscrossed the city of Boston. And seen here is streetcar 86 that connected Boston via the south end to Roxbury, terminating at the Norfolk House on Roxbury Meeting House Hill. And with most of the horses in Boston suffering from the equine flu, in November of 1872, conductors and passengers are depicted in this etching pulling a streetcar along its tracks during the epizootic. Of course, the satire shows this, the etching of a chivalrous patient. This appeared in Harper's Weekly on November 16th of 1872 and depicts a horse suffering the epizootic with his hooves in a warm pail of water, a blanket around his shoulders, and a steaming hot toddy and medicine beside him. Well, this was something that really did affect not just Boston, but much of the eastern United States. But seen here from a hot air balloon, this was Boston in the period of 1872. The title of the photograph, which is a detail of a much larger photograph, is Boston as the Eagle and the Wild Goose See It. It was a detail of a photograph taken by James Wallace Black in 1860 from Samuel King's hot air balloon called the Queen of the Air. In 1863, Holmes wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, Boston, as the Eagle and Wild Goose See It, is a very different object from the same place as the solid citizen looks up at its eaves and chimneys. And if you look midpoint on the left, one sees the spire of the Old South Meeting House, and if you follow that down 45 degrees, on the right bottom you see the crenellated tower of Trinity Church. This, all the way to the waterfront, was what was destroyed in 1872. Well, the story started in this building. It was the Kloos building, actually built by Lehman Kloos, a German immigrant, and it was leased to various concerns, but the top 3 floors were a hoop skirt factory. And the story went that a spark from the furnace ignited a bale of cotton that would be used when the hoop skirts were actually done to keep them in a way that would create a skirt for a lady. As a result, the building was engulfed in flames, and because the mansard roof, very fashionable, was built with wood trussing, it would burn almost immediately. And in this instance, I call this chapter The Lurid Light of a Burning Cauldron. The fire had begun in the Kloos building on Summer Street, which was engulfed in flames within minutes. The fury of the fire rose to the wood frame mansard roof that burnt out of reach of fire hoses and continued unabated until the flames inevitably spread from one mansard roof to the next. The heat from the burning buildings, the geysers of sparks and embers, became infernal, and its intensity caused the granite facades to implode, falling to the street. It was said that blocks of granite, weighing tons, were split as if by powder and hurled across wide streets. Well, the fire spread, and Russell Conwell, who wrote a history of the fire, remembered, in a falling building on Franklin Street, there were seen through the flashes of fire the forms of men attempting to leap from the windows, but they never reached the pavement. Their cries were heard above the crashing timbers and the noise of explosions, awakening shrilly echoes in the ears of those who heard, which will never cease to call. And at the time of the fire, the face of the granite was peeled off like a chestnut in a toaster, and great granite chips tumbled to the ground as if invisible hand with mallet and steel were at work, bent on defacing the smooth surface and sharp lines with all the haste possible. Facades of the commercial blocks fell with a sudden roar, sending up showers of sparks and cinders, as well as a lurid black smoke that enveloped the streets. However, it was not just commercial blocks that were aflame. Even churches were engulfed in fire. And seen here was John Damrell, and he's seen with his initials on his belt buckle. He's holding a leather helmet with his chief badge, and his brass speaking trumpet under his arm. It said that Damrell was elected to the position of chief engineer of Boston Fire Department in 1866. He warned city officials about the danger of fire in the business district, and he is concerned with the water supply, shortage of fire hydrants, lack of fire equipment, and the density of tall buildings with wooden mansard roofs in the district. And recognizing the need for long-term improvements in construction practices, he also advocated for the establishment of a building department and building inspection services with the authority to enforce fire and building codes. Well, the whole aspect was the firemen were pulling fire engines. Now, though this is a Currier and Ives print and it's called An American Fireman, it actually is something that's very indicative of 1872. With no horses to pull these 2-ton engines, they would be pulled by volunteer firefighters as well as the few professional firefighters the city actually had. And they would go 8 to 10 blocks before they could finally arrive, usually winded. By the time they arrived, buildings were engulfed in flames. This is the Cathedral building, built in 1869 to the tune of $300,000, which was a tremendous sum of money, and it burnt within 40 minutes. Not only was there type and wood, but there were also chemicals that were used in the publication of the pilot. And in some ways, as the fire continued to spread, it also brought in the curious onlookers, and you can see them in the foreground. It's not just the firemen and volunteer firemen, it's the public, merchants, clerks, as well as everyone who could get there within walking distance. Many times, prints that were done after the fact, and this is Into the Jaws of Death, that appeared in Harper's Weekly, we see firemen, mostly from Boston, and volunteer firemen actually battling the blaze. The man squirts a fire hose at the fire. But because this was a residential neighborhood, which once only had 3-story buildings, the water pressure could never go above the 3rd story. These were now 5-story buildings, and of course they had mansard roofs built of wood. So the concept was they were daunted in all of their efforts to actually fight the fire. Well, of course, many paintings were done, and this was done in 1876. The title is The Boston Fire, a view of Boston from across the harbor in East Boston, which was painted by F. William Shaw. John Damrell, the city's fire engineer, described the fire as the conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury, and it was the most terrific engagement by the fire department for superiority over the fire fiend ever recorded in the annals of the city. And one can imagine, not just the glare of the fire, but the intensity of the smoke could be seen for miles in all directions. Even Currier and Ives, that did this in, of course, December of 1872 after the fact, would have a huge, wonderful lithograph that not only showed the fire burning the area, but also the coal wharves that projected into the harbor. We're probably all too young to remember when the coal was used in fireplaces as well as furnaces. But the aspect was these docks that projected into the harbor were the coal wharves. So not only were they built of wood, but they had coal that would smolder until everything was destroyed. You see in the distance the State House dome, and of course not only spires of church and the Bunker Hill Monument on the right, but as I mentioned in the foreground, thousands of people would pay $1 apiece to actually get as close as to the fire to observe it as they could. And I call this chapter Flown Away as an Eagle Towards Heaven. Well, the fire burnt throughout the night, creating a macabre scene that could only be likened to that of Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Overworked firemen, frantic merchants, and curious onlookers made the scene one of utter chaos. The fire was so intense that men could see the light flaming against the midnight sky, growing wider, broader, and higher. Its flame so high that it becomes a beacon light to mariners 300 miles away, so bright that it gilds not only the dome of the State House and surrounding spires, but lights up the blue hills of Milton. The epicenter of the conflagration was engulfed in flames, and Frothingham, who again wrote a book on the history, said that blocks of granite weighing tons were split as if by gunpowder and hurled across wide streets, and planks went flying through the air as if they were feathers. People screaming, firemen yelling orders with no one paying any heed, and the crash of falling blocks of granite, the hum of engines, the roar of the seething flames, and the hiss of steam as immense volumes of water were poured in upon the burning mass, and the shouting of firemen made up a babel of horrible sounds. It was like a pandemonium. Well, by the period of midnight, not just were Boston firefighters actually on duty, but Boston began to telegraph to every city and town in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, and Maine, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and many of them would send fire engines and firefighters by train to Boston. This was from the supplement to Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and it showed an etching by J.B. Henderson on the arrival of the special train from Worcester, conveying the Worcester Fire Department with steam fire engines to the scene of the disaster. The frantic and highly charged scene as a fire engine is removed from the flatbed of the train can be sensed as it was eased onto a ramp and then pulled by hand to the fire as hundreds watched from the sidelines. The fire was devastating, and a little bit of a close-up or detail of Russell's map of Boston shows the area, and at the very top it's Washington Street, between Summer Street on the left and Milk Street on the right, all the way to the waterfront. 65 acres that represented banking and insurance, as well as not only the cotton trade and leather trade, but even the shoe industry. It was valuable land, and it was gone within 15 hours. And seen here is a panoramic view. Seen from the roof of C.F. Hovey Company on Summer Street, this photograph looks across to what had once been Franklin and Milk Streets after the Great Fire of 1872. Russell Conwell said, "The vista from the vicinity of Summer Street was grandiose and disheartening. Flames flickered up from time to time from the mass of broken, seared, disjointed masonry, played around the cracked and dismantled bases of the great carved iron pillars, and sometimes burst out vehemently from the interstices of the debris. And great columns of smoke rose majestically into the clean air, and then formed a party-colored clouds which cast dull shadows over the scene." People could not believe it. It wasn't just photographed, but even painters. This is a painting, The Ruins of Boston, by John Enneking, and is a striking scene in its graphic realism of the devastating fire. It was said that it was almost if a thick, blood-red cloud was hovering over the city, as the Boston Globe article from November 11th of 1872 said, filling the hearts of all with an ominous and indefinable mixture of terror and sadness. Lucius Beebe said, "Sunday morning dawned on a tremendously yellow pillar of smoke which rolled like a symbol of doom slowly over the harbor." And on the left is the spire of the Park Street Church with the dome of the State House. Well, people looked at this as something that was just incredible. This is Washington Street, and one sees the Old South Meeting House, which was saved by not only firefighters from New Hampshire, but the firefighters' own Amuskeg engine, which they brought from Manchester, New Hampshire. It played water on the wood spire and the brick sides to actually keep it completely moist, and it didn't have much damage at all. The buildings in the foreground looked like they were saved, but it was only the facades. Everything behind that was destroyed. And one began to realize in some ways that the area became known as the Burnt District. Well, John Damrell, the city's fire engineer, was an integral witness to the destruction of the area by fire and described its progress. The conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury and was the most terrific engagement by the fire department for superiority over the fire fiend ever recorded in the annals of the city. One can only imagine the confusion and anxiety of the firemen as fire chiefs shouted orders from their fire trumpets to men who could hardly hear above the roar of the fire and shouting spectators. Even if they could hear, the scene was one of such utter chaos that it only increased with time. A lack of water power from inadequate sources, and the fact that water could only reach to the third story of the five-story buildings daunted the efforts of the firemen, who watched and were unable to do anything to check the fire spread. In addition, people were hindering the efforts of the firefighters, and something had to be done. Russell Conwell said, "Cordons of soldiery with fixed bayonets kept off the pressing crowd, or capturing a host of citizens between two lines, reaching from curb to curb, marching them to the side streets and gently expelling them from the vicinity of the crumbling and overhanging ruins. The roll of the drum was heard on every side. The sonorous fall in echoed, and those turbulently inclined among such of the spectators as had not directly felt the sting of loss by the conflagration were speedily subdued by the militiamen, who seemed to bear a full sense of their importance." Drawn up at Liberty Square, which when actually the area was cleared was renamed Post Office Square, are the Claflin Guards. This is Newton Company C, 1st Regiment, Massachusetts Militia. They were called out by the governor, and they're drawn up in formation on Kilby Street. Mayor William Gaston had requested, as Sunday drew to a smoky and hysterical close, that exhausted as they were, the police would not be sufficient to maintain order throughout the city. 6 battalions of the state militia were mobilized, and although martial law was never declared, so that these actually had no authority, the crowds naturally imagined that they had, and their presence was respected accordingly. Seen in the center is Captain William Barner Sears, on the left, 1st Lieutenant Barnes, and on the right, 2nd Lieutenant Stearns, in front of the militia, drawn up in formation. They protected the area with a double line surrounding it. But if one wished to pass into the burnt district, you could apply for a pass. Now this actually says, "Pass the bearer within the lines enclosing the burnt district." This was an important feature because many people wanted to see what was left of their business. Now, from the photographs we've seen so far, not much was left. But remember, as wooden floors burnt, safes fell to the basement. And many times, some of these safes would have contained hundreds of thousands of dollars and securities. And they wanted to see whatever they could survive. Seen here, members of Sheridan's Rifle Guard were quartered at the Old South Meeting House, which was still an active place of worship at the time of the fire. A new church was to be built in Copley Square in 1876 and is today called New Old South Church. And here soldiers posed for a photograph, some leaning on the high box pews, others standing on them, as they were on break from their guard duty. The box pews, which had once served as seats for worshipers, now served as hard beds for the soldiers, and they would live there for 6 months. And seen here in front of the partially completed United States Post Office and Sub-Treasury at Liberty Square, later to be known as Post Office Square, are members of the Boston Police Department. They actually were taxed for over 2 days with their efforts to help protect the city, but they actually would pose, as many people did, with the thousands of people being photographed by various photographers. And seen here, the area of Milk and Federal Streets were the ruins of Wright and Potter, the state printer. The company was owned by Albert Wright and Robert Potter, and though the building was destroyed, the tall brick chimney marks the spot of the business, which has a sign stating that they have relocated to 34 School Street. Members of the Claflin Guard are seen on the right, with rifles protecting the burnt district. It wasn't so much the fact that they were protecting it with rifles, they were protecting what they thought might be safes in the rubble. But of course, seen here, Colonel Russell Conwell, in his book, The History of the Great Fire of Boston, describes the burnt district as, in the stead of noble buildings of granite and marble and brick, were huge giant walls, torn and ragged, and broken columns of stone and iron. The lines of the street were entirely obliterated, and the ways were so blocked by great boulders of granite and heaps of debris, in some places from 3 to 10 feet deep, that those who had been most familiar with the section of The city before the fire were utterly unable to find their way and groped about or clambered over the obstructing rock, brick, iron, and still hot rubbish, dazed and bewildered. And in that instance, even here in the days following the fire, canvas tents and temporary wood sheds with corrugated metal roofs were erected on cleared areas for those working in the burnt district to rest or have refreshments. Here, in the shadow of the spire of the Old South Meeting House on Milk Street, men are gathered around a Liberty pole, and this is Liberty Square, as they began the arduous job of rolling miles of canvas fire hoses and clearing away the debris which was dumped into Boston Harbor and along what became Atlantic Avenue. In that instance, Liberty Square, as we know, became Post Office Square. This would actually show the debris, many times 3, 4, 5 feet in height, and it has not just firemen, merchants, clerks, but even the men in the foreground on the left that opened the various shops that began to provide all the essentials for the people working to clear the burnt district. This was an important feature because the area was littered with so much debris, which many of it could not be moved by human force. It had to be done with all sorts of winches and steam engines, would actually see period of destruction. This was Trinity Church. And though today we know Trinity Church is at Copley Square in Boston, and the congregation had already planned and purchased land in Back Bay to move to, they were still worshiping in the church. This is at the site of what is today Summer Street and Hawley Street. You might remember it as Filene's. But this was a building that was built of solid granite, and of course with people photographed in the foreground. But this was actually the church of the Reverend Phillips Brooks. He had been rector of Trinity Church since 1869. And he said, "The desolation of the fire is bewildering. Old Trinity seemed safe all night, but towards morning the fire swept into her and there was no chance. She went at 4 a.m. I saw her well afire, inside and out, carried off some books and robes, and left her. She went majestically, and her great tower stands now as solid as ever, a most picturesque and stately ruin. She died in dignity. I did not know how much I liked the gloomy old thing until I saw her windows bursting and the flame running along her high old pews." So it wasn't just the church that was destroyed, but of course the floors. And it opened up the crypts that were under the church. Now, commenting on the ruins of Trinity Church, Edwin Monroe Bacon said that its broken tower and partly crumbled walls presented the most picturesque ruin of all that costly conflagration. The interior of Trinity Church had been destroyed of everything except the stone walls, including the floor, exposing the family tombs and the crypt. And though the iron doors remained in place, within just a few days after the fire, the city of Boston notified families to remove the remains from the crypts and rebury them in a cemetery. Mount Auburn, Forest Hills, Mount Hope, even Cedar Grove and Dorchester have the reinterred remains. But the surprising thing is, when they were building Filene's, of course they had a basement. Does anybody remember Filene's basement? They did the excavations in 1911. They actually found the remains of some of the crypts with bodies in them. But seen here, Milk Street, which extends from Washington Street to Atlantic Avenue, lay in ruins from the rear of the Old South Meeting House to Oliver Street at Liberty Square. Soldiers stand among the granite blocks of the ruins of a building, with many men gathered in the street on the right. Every bit of vantage ground, from the dread corner near which the fatal fire began to the waterside and along State, was crowded with the motley groups of spectators, each asking 100 questions in as many breaths. And here, 2 merchants, one in a bowler and the other in a top hat, a policeman, and a man sitting on a board are photographed among the debris and the ruins of the buildings on Arch Street. The tower of Trinity Church is seen in the distance and is enveloped in a haze, creating an almost ethereal scene to the burnt district. It was said, approaching the burnt district, one might readily have fancied himself in a recently captured and bombarded town. And it was said that ladies, of course escorted by gentlemen, ventured into the midst of the burnt district. And they had been clambering all day over the ruins of their husbands' and fathers' warehouses, and listening with a sort of pride to their escorts describing the magnitude of their losses. Well, one began to realize that the ruins were picturesque and fascinating, and the devastation of the burnt district was incomprehensible. Streets were covered in granite blocks and mounds of bricks from which iron pillars that had once supported the 5-story commercial blocks lay bent and twisted. The area east of Washington Street was one large debris field that attracted the attention of Bostonians. It was said that on Monday, November 11th of 1872, there were pictures of awful desolation and ruin in one great section. And immediately about and around, in marked contrast, pictures of a holiday or gala day kind, where strangers thronged unceasingly from morning till night, looking contented, interested, and happy, watching the cavalry as they cantered by, examining the wares of the itinerant peddlers on the Tremont Mall, studying the smoky sky through the big telescope, or trying the lung testers, carrying themselves for all the world as if it were a festival that they had journeyed hither to see, rather than the destruction of a great section of a great city by fire. In this instance, people, merchants, clerks, and anyone of interest could sit on these ruins. And you see on the left-hand side these cast iron columns that were used throughout the 1860s to actually support individual floors. But these fingers look like pointing towards the heavens of not only granite but also brick. In some ways, many of the companies that were there had their offices in downtown Boston. And this was the remains of the H&J Pfaff Brewery Company. It had been founded in 1857 by German immigrants Henry and Jacob Pfaff, and its beer was made from the good, crisp-tasting water of the Stony Brook in Roxbury to produce not just beer, but the lighter lager. And with a large German population in Boston in the 1870s, the Pfaff Brewery was extremely popular. Their office was on Arch Street, and I assume that within this group of men, at least Henry and Jacob Pfaff are probably photographed. We also began to realize is this huge amount, and we don't even know where this photograph is actually taken, but all things must come to an end. And after 18 hours of trial, Boston emerged from her baptism of fire. In that space of time, it had destroyed hundreds of the costliest and most substantial warehouses in the country. This photograph shows the other devastation wrought by the fire. Shells of buildings and walls pointing like fingers towards the heavens served as grim reminders of the once urban streetscapes of Boston. The granite blocks in the foreground would be used for infill on Atlantic Avenue. And seen here, an archway of ruins was depicted in what was the former Boston Button Company on Milk Street, and was photographed by James Black, as well as sketched for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. It was said the archway of ruins on Milk Street is an artistic feat of the fire fiend, and presents the appearance of some classical ruin of ancient Rome or Greece, Babylon, Thebes, or Tyre. In some ways, these were incredible. A photograph, again by James Black, shows men standing on the rubble of Brewer and Tileston Company, which was owned by Thomas Mayer Brewer and John Boyes Tileston, and located on Milk Street. Brewer and Tileston were well-known printers and booksellers, and in the 1870s would annually print the Old Farmer's Almanac. The 3 granite piers are what remains of the building, with massive granite blocks strewn in the foreground. And here, a guard stands in front of the tri-arched entrance to what was once McCullough, Williams, and Parker Company on Washington Street, with a sign stating that the company removed to 15 Tremont Street. A well-known wholesale and retail dealer of ready-made and custom clothing and men's furnishing goods, the store was one of the largest in the city, extending from Washington Street to Hawley Street, or what is basically, again, Filene's. The facade was of white marble, made in Italy, and remarkably survived the fire though the 5-story business was completely destroyed. And seen here again, a horse-drawn wagon is seen near Congress Street at Liberty Square. Lucius Beebe said, by the end of the week, the devastated section of the city showed signs of recovered order, and although smoke still curled from numerous cellars, and the protective agents were still engaged in tearing down tottering walls and chimneys, little shops, barber saloons, bars, and chop houses were springing into being under canvas tents or in hastily erected sheds and pine board shelters. Seen here was a milk wagon from the Consumers Protection Association on Hanover Street in the North End, and they delivered milk and dairy products to those who were working in the burnt district. There were hundreds of people working in the area, some living in wood shelters, and members of the militia quartered at the Old South Meeting House. This photograph is interesting. It shows the delivery wagon driver holding the reins of the horse with the policeman to the right, and the men standing on the debris with Milk Street in the distance. Well, they said that the site was a peculiar one. Well, the other devastation of the burnt district in the days after the fire was beyond comprehension. And standing on Washington Street, one could see to the waterfront, with whole blocks leveled by fire. Smoke still rose from cellar holes where wood and combustible materials lay and smolder, creating an eerie and unearthly light as the dawn broke. The history of the Great Conflagration states huge fields of glowing ruins, covered with smoldering Lambert fires, occasionally broken by piles of half-destroyed debris or standing walls, up which the blaze climbed and played, while overall hung a dense, murky pall of smoke, slowly floating to the southward in rolling, heavy billows, borne by the gentle breeze. And seen here in a detail, which I was very proud to acquire on eBay, but my puppy was teething, and I no longer have this. It was, I know, you laugh, I don't. It's called Boston, Picturesque Scenes and Incidents, and it was a collage of sketches by well-known artist, illustrator Paul Frenenzi that appeared in Harper's Weekly on December 7th of 1872, and it shows the highs and lows of the Great Boston Fire. Individual scenes the artist depicts are fighting it behind the barricades, the outside aid coming, selling relics, Boston pluck, after the struggle, thieves and rogues arrested and looking at the ruins. These were things that were seen not just locally but across the country, and people could not understand the devastation. Chicago had only burnt the year before in 1871, and now Boston, with 65 acres, merchants would turn out in force. And this is Milk Street. You can see in the distance towards Atlantic Avenue, it actually survived the fire. But this is an area that would be cleared for Post Office Square. A detail of a much larger photograph shows a merchant leaning against a granite block. Maybe that's his building. 3 windows, they still survive, but everything else is destroyed. And we began to realize there was a sense of shock and devastation, but there was a sense of rebuilding. And here at the corner of High, Pearl, and Summer Street, it shows a triangular Flatiron building, 4 stories in height, with only the curved portion actually surviving. Summer Street has been cleared of all debris, which you see on the right-hand side, at least 4 feet high, and we see hundreds of people that would just simply cascade up and down the streets with such a force that many people realized that this was truly something that was a visitation intended to shock the minds of our citizens. Well, the reaction by ministers to the devastation wrought by the Great Fire was swift and condemning, and was to be fodder for sermons for the next few months. Frothingham said that people, instead of attending divine service, thronged to the streets immediately about the fire, and churches were deserted. However, the following Sunday, ministers throughout Boston preached on the fire and its implications on life, greed, and loss. The Reverend Dr. Manning of the South Chapel preached, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." The Reverend Dr. Webb of the Shawmut Congregational Church preached, "Shall there be an evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it?" And of course, the Reverend John Beckley of the Somerset Street Baptist Church preached, "Every man's work shall be manifest, when the day shall declare it, for it shall be revealed by fire." However, it was the Reverend Cyrus Bartol of the West Church who preached the trial by fire, in which he delivered a sermon that was said to be a fine analysis of the influence of a great disaster upon the human mind, an acute essay on the harmony of nature above and below and beyond the local derangement of the elements, and was, withal, filled with sound, practical suggestions as to improved methods of city building and a severe invective against the spirit of lawlessness now pervading the country. The conflagration should be considered not merely as an accident which could be easily repaired, but as a visitation intended to shock the minds of our citizens into a due sense of the undue greed and haste which led to the building of mushroom blocks. Well, Columbia, the personification of the United States, actually kneels before the burning Boston. She casts her laurels aside, as you see on the left-hand side, and the devil, which actually has a burning torch, ascends to the heavens. As it says, Boston, Mass., the homestead of liberty, yet it was destroyed in some instances. Well, Colonel Russell Conwell was the author of the History of the Great Fire in Boston, which recounted the impact of the fire on the city, and was written to place before the present generation, 1872, a readable and trustworthy account of the Great Fire in Boston. Conwell had attended Yale and studied law at the Albany Law School, and was later ordained a Baptist minister. He is best remembered as the founder and first president of Temple University in Philadelphia, and today, Conwell's name lives on in the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in North Andover. There was also Harvey Washington Wiley, who, as an adult, became known as the father of pure food. But he was a student at Harvard at the time and was a volunteer firefighter at the Great Boston Fire, joining with others as they pulled a fire engine by hand from Cambridge across the West Boston Bridge spanning the Charles River. The engine, he said, which I had been assigned, was directly across from my rooming house on Church Street in Cambridge. In a short time, 100 students assembled at this machine, and we were told that the fire was in Boston, and we could see the glow without any difficulty. On either side of a long rope, we started for Boston. We urged our engine forward with all the power we had, fearing that the fire would be put out before we got there. Well, the supply of water was not very abundant in this locality because when it was changed from residence to business, the water service had not been enlarged. There was also Louisa May Alcott, and she said that the fire was so great that it created a whirlwind and an awful roar. I saw blazing boards, great pieces of cloth and rolls of paper flying in all directions, flying on roofs and spreading the fire. The granite blocks on Franklin Street went down like card houses, and heavy cornices peeled off as if of paper. Firemen could not go up their ladders, the heat was so intense, and many were killed by falling walls. The red glare, the strange roar, the flying people, all made the night terrible, and I kept thinking of the last days of Pompeii. Even the Reverend Cyrus Bartol, as I mentioned, was the minister of the West Church on Cambridge Street in Boston's West End. He was graduated from Bowdoin College and the Harvard Divinity School, and not only preached for 50 years, but was an author who would publish articles in various periodicals, including the Christian Examiner, the North American Review, and the Unitarian Review, which I'm sure we've all read. In 1849, he published Hymns for the Sanctuary, also known as the West Boston Collection, and was well respected for his insightful writing. The New York Tribune referred to Bartol as probably the most successful minister in Boston, and it was his sermon, The Trial by Fire, that actually caused so much controversy. Bartol preached a sermon, The Trial by Fire, and his sermon was both powerful and thought-provoking. And a quote from the moving sermon is as follows: For our calamity is our penalty, a fine we pay, long ago predicted to our inflammable architecture by prophets of combustion, yet defied by greed of rapid gain, but coming to pass as naturally in the high tinderboxes ranged close together out of reach of the engines, as when you drill a hole and put in that charge and light the fuse or lay the train, the blast follows. Well, many people came to the conclusion that people had to actually do something that would be decisive to assist. Many insurance companies failed. There was just too many claims. The governor was William Bartlett Washburn, and after the fire he was instrumental in urging the legislature to be called into special session to enable the provision of state assistance for the rebuilding of Boston. Measures passed, including a bill simplifying the establishment of insurance companies, since several were bankrupted by the blaze, and a bill authorizing the city to issue bonds to speed the rebuilding effort, which would encompass 65 acres of Boston. He also declared a proclamation, which was a public thanksgiving and praise. Governor Washburn, and it was called a proclamation for a day of public thanksgiving and praise, was to place on November 27, 1872, and it was in reaction to the extreme severity of the fire in Boston. His proclamation declared a day, thanksgiving to God the Creator and Preserver for the favor shown unto us during the year, and that most of our industries have prospered, that the storehouses are filled with an abundant harvest, and that we have suffered so little from the great fire in our chief city, 65 acres. I'm seeing here a painting that actually is entitled The Boston Fire of November 8th of 1872, it's actually the 9th, was painted by Fred Phelps. And the painting shows the fire spreading along the dock seen from East Boston across Boston Harbor. And there is a ship in the harbor and small boats, but the fire illuminated the night sky and attracted large numbers of curious people who either gathered to watch the fire or from afar, but Bostonians viewed the blaze as an awesome spectacle. But there were also sheet musics, different things that were done. And this is called Homeless Tonight, or Boston in Ashes. And it was a song composed by Charles White, which was published by White, Smith & Perry of Boston. The cover of the sheet music was printed by J.H. Bufford's Sons in 1872 and depicts two terrified young girls clinging to one another as they escape from the burning city with the tower of Trinity Church on Summer Street in flames behind them. One poignant stanza of the song was, "Who will pity us, and who will give us shelter through this sad and lonely night?" Well, the music was something that was incredible. The sheet music of Homeless Tonight was written by, of course, Charles Wright, who was a well-known songwriter of the period. And the sheet music proved so popular that it ran through several editions and was a piece for piano that could be played at home and thereby rekindle memories of the fire. White's lyrics created a sentimental and heartfelt pity for the two young orphans depicted on the sheet music cover. And the first lines are, "Lone and weary through the streets we wander, for we have no place to lay our heads. Not a friend on earth is left to shelter us, for both our parents now are dead. Poor mother died when we were both young, yet father made for us a home. But now he's killed by falling timbers, and we are left here all alone." Very sad, but very poignant. But Boston did recover, and I call the chapter here "Springing Phoenix-like from the Ashes." Well, the devastation of the fire was tremendous, and was a shock not just to Bostonians, but to the readers of national newspapers. The New York Tribune had reporters and correspondents sending information for the daily news, as well as artists who sketched the ruins. The newspapers printed thousands of words of dispatches, including an hour-by-hour account of the progress of the blaze, a complete list of the destroyed properties, maps of the Boston business district, the assets and Boston liabilities of scores of insurance companies, stories on the local angle of the calamity, and other features, many of which might imagine the devastating only of the recent high-pressure reporting. And day after day, new stories were printed, including that in the New York Times on November 13th of 1872, that boldly declared Boston alive again, and that businessmen too busy to mourn over their losses. Indeed, the regrouping in Yankee pluck was more than evident as businesses relocated and began anew. And seen here, the scene of the fire when it began on that Saturday evening at 7 p.m. would be rebuilt in 2 years. The Church Green, and on the left, which is the site of that octagonal church, Church Green is the junction of Bedford and Summer Streets and was rebuilt after the fire, with 5- and 6-story commercial buildings that created an impressive streetscape along with interesting signage in the 1870s. In this vein, Cyrus Bartol said, "Boston admires Boston. She is worthy the admiration she wins from those she bore not in her borders or far away. She gets up quickly from her fall, rubs her robes, professes she is not hurt, makes nobly light and laughs at her hoist to the ground. She says she is no beggar and wants to refuse the alms, like a prince she has bestowed. A grand temper not unbecoming, but to be prized as one of the pillars of virtue." Well, the man who oversaw the rebuilding of the city was George Clough. Clough was a well-known architect, and he was elected the first city architect of the city of Boston. It was a wonderful position because not only did he oversee the rebuilding of the burnt district, but he also designed every new schoolhouse, fire station, police station, and municipal building in Boston from 1873 until 1881, when he did not seek re-election. And of course, the city, seen here on Milk Street, looking towards Washington Street, was completely filled and done by 1875. These buildings, which still stand, had in the very center the original birthplace of Benjamin Franklin. This structure actually has a bust of Franklin directly above, and it's called the Franklin Building. They're decorated for the centennial of the United States in 1876, and on the far left one can see the Centennial Lunchroom. This whole concept showed the rebuilding beginning as early as January of 1873 and really being completed no later than 1877. Even the post office and sub-treasury, and this was designed by Alfred Mullett in association with Gridley J. Fox Bryant and Alexander Estey, it was in the process of being built when the fire destroyed the surrounding area. It was the most impressive building built during the Victorian period and was in the Renaissance style and built of granite. On the tops of the 2 towers flanking the center roof were 2 17-foot-high white marble statues by Daniel Chester French. On the left was labor, supporting domestic life and sustaining the fine arts, and on the right, science, which was controlling the forces of the newfangled electricity and steam. And in the center portion was ornamented with a heraldic figure, which was appropriately an eagle with outspread wings, grasping a shield with its talons. And as you can see, not only was it complete by 1878, but Post Office Square, something of our generation, is now completely laid out. And here on Washington Street, with the Old South Meeting House in the distance, shows the new buildings that had replaced what had once been the debris field. The buildings, in this instance, had many different small shops. They had bowling alleys, they had pool rooms, as well as businesses, and in the very center, you can see Raymond's, a department store with Uncle Eve and Aunt Abby were the iconography of that business. So the downtown district was completely rebuilt by 1880, a financial insurance area, along with the great department stores. So in this book, Inferno, the Great Boston Fire of 1872, what I've really tried to do is show in wonderful photographs, many of which have never been published before, the aspect of the destruction. 65 acres doesn't sound like a tremendous area, but it's almost the entire downtown district. And we look at it as something in some ways that this fire not only chronicled in paintings and lithographs, but also in wonderful photographs, because I can actually gear up at least a dozen photography studios that took photographs of something that comes down to us for the 150th anniversary. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Please. Oh, how are you?
The way you're talking, it was a business district that burned, but at the end you had that song showing a family of orphans.
Right.
That doesn't seem appropriate. Were there any residents burned in that fire?
There were no residents burned. 21 firefighters were killed in the line of duty, and I dedicated the book to those 21 firefighters. There were 19 professional firefighters and 2 volunteers. There were still some residents in the area. I would say less than 4 to 5%. But they were usually people's homes that had just never changed. And you realize in some ways that though it was almost completely commercial, there were still people that did live there. It was also the place that we saw still Trinity Church was a place of worship. And when we think of a neighborhood, it's not just a place to live, but it's all the things that add to a neighborhood. So Trinity was there, a few residents, as well as, of course, Phillips Brooks' own house, which was on Summer Street. But it really did become mostly commercial. Please.
Did fire engineer John L. have a big influence going forward on fire and building code?
Well,
He seemed to be ahead of his time.
he was very ahead of his time, and he actually even went to Chicago to study the fire itself. No, actually, he took the blame. Even though he'd been, since 1866, advising the mayor and the Common Council, which is the Board of Aldermen, he was the one who took the fall. And he lost his job. And he went on to the National Protection Fire Association, which today is in Quincy, Massachusetts. And he was somebody who did national legislation for the protection of buildings as well as the public in regards to fires. And he was somebody, eventually even left the city. He lived on Beacon Hill, and he moved to Dover, Massachusetts. He was so vilified, but he became well respected by 1885. He didn't die until 1905, but he took the fall. Any other questions? Please.
Are any of the paintings in local museums?
It was funny you say that. There are some. Museum of Fine Arts, the Massachusetts Historical Society, as well as the Parkman House on Beacon Hill. But do you remember the one with the wonderful Rococo gold frame? That was being sold. I bid on that a few years ago at Coyle's Auction House. I bid, I thought, a high enough price, but I didn't get it. But a lot of them are still on the market, and they can be purchased. A lot of the ephemera, prints, are really quite nice, and I collected as much as I can. I don't keep these things. They go to the archives of the University of Massachusetts. So say you wanted to do an article, they're there 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, available to the public, and a lot of times, you know, it's kind of fun. I have done 85 books. This is my 85th book. So when you think of all of the research that I collect, it's something in some ways that somebody can reinterpret it. It's not that I know everything about it, but you might want to do something on the firefighters of 19th century Boston. And then I have all of these different things, including photographs. So it's a way to look at it as what comes up on the market. It does sell high. But I was very disappointed that time. I've gotten over it, but I was. Any other questions? Oh, please.
How did they remove all the debris and the tall structures that were still left standing?
That's right. One of the things is they knocked down the brick walls and the granite immediately because many people were, you know, swarming the area. And what would happen, what if it fell? It would kill the people. So they tried to move quickly to remove anything that was protecting. The horses were still sick as late as the beginning of December. So you needed horsepower to pull many of these pieces. But though they looked small, those boulders were 1,000 to 2,000 pounds each. So they had to do hydraulic steam lifting. Now, John Souther, who created the steam shovel that filled the Back Bay of Boston, saw his shovels being used to take these and then dump them into the harbor. Atlantic Avenue was actually the edge of the waterfront, and by dumping them there, they created a solid fill. And then, of course, the area of Atlantic Avenue and Commercial Street were laid out in the downtown and the North End. But it was a devastating thing, but it took less than 6 to 8 months to clear the whole area. And then, of course, there were new provisions. They had to have buildings that didn't have wood truss mansard roofs. Mansard roofs were banned by the city. They also had to have firewalls, and they could only be built of brick or marble or limestone. This was something they thought would actually preclude no fires in the future. It wasn't true. But Clough was very serious about this, as was Damrell. Any other questions? Please.
Thank you. Fire, I think you said it extended down to the coal docks.
Yes.
In your research, did you run into any photographs of the docks? Most of them seem like on the city streets. Anything on the waterfront?
The problem was you did see lots of photography after daylight arose. Night photography didn't exist. But because they were the coal wharves, they were wooden wharves that projected into the harbor. The coal would actually be piled because what would you do, a scuttle of coal? These were things. Well, the coal burnt until everything just fell into the water. So there was nothing to photograph. So the whole aspect was, I'm sure the waterfront itself had the remnants of some pilings, but even they would have burnt. But I think it was something that wouldn't have been photographed because there was nothing to see. So, please. Oh, T Wharf, well, T Wharf, don't forget, it's part of Long Wharf, and Long Wharf is the longest wharf. It was 200 feet projecting into the harbor. It was really an extension of State Street. But T Wharf probably dated to the period of 1890 to 1895. And that was something that, just a little bit after, but it had nothing to do with the fire. It was something that provided a breakwater to the waterfront with the ocean. As we all know, the city has got lots of ocean front, but we don't really see it unless we're in tall buildings. So T Wharf is a little bit later. One last question, please. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Well, it's funny. I mean, for 25 years I've been collecting it. I'm also doing a book on every neighborhood of the city of Boston right now. I did them many years ago, I hate to say. I had dark hair, a dark mustache, and a 35-inch waist. But that was a long time ago. So Font Hill, which is owned by the man that started the Arcadia series, do you know the sepia tone covers every city, town, and state? Well, he wanted something that actually had like a then and now. So I've already done Brighton and Allston, East Boston, Jamaica Plain, Kenmore Square and the Fenway. I just finished Mattapan, Beacon Hill, Back Bay. So I'm doing one. I think there are 21 neighborhoods. I've subdivided Mission Hill and Roxbury. I've also subdivided some of the other areas. But I think one of the things is I collect every single day, whether I buy it on eBay or if they don't have an indicia that actually precludes you can't use it, I save it to a file. And it's fun. It's something that we remember. And these are 20th century history. They're not 17th, 18th, or 19th century. They're more of the things of our life, our parents, and our grandparents. So it's 20th century Boston and the topographical and architectural changes. These are fun. They're books that are meant to make people think. I teach at Boston University Metropolitan College, and yes, I do have traditional students, 18 to 22, but it's primarily people that are returning to get their undergraduate degree evenings after working all day. I don't know how they do it. I do it, but I love it. But the idea is, in that instance, they're taking it, unlike I want to believe that they're fascinated with history, what they're taking it for is the 4 credits in humanities. So I don't want them to be deluded that history can be fun. And we do these things, and we do a walking tour. I take them to lunch, and then we actually go around and try to explore the built Boston. Most of us know Back Bay is totally infilled. It's created land. It was the 19th century big dig. So in that way, what they do in some aspects is to look at something and realize how fun history really is. And it encompasses everything from architecture, social development, Revolutionary War, immigrant history, as well as sports. So people can choose. I give 25 options for a final paper. Heaven forbid it's late. But the idea is that's something they can choose. So don't we do better with things we enjoy doing? So that's something in a lot of ways to make them realize that they actually do learn while they're having fun. I'll tell one last story. I did have students for, well, the first 2 to 3 years that were young men who had been on scholarship for the ice hockey team at Boston University. They were always the best looking young men. They were muscular. December 1st, they're still wearing shorts and flip-flops. And I'd sit there and I think, geez, and some of them had good questions and good answers, but every other week I was called by admissions to find out how they were doing. And I couldn't imagine the first year why. Well, of course, they got to keep their grades up. So the first year, when I gave the 25 different topics they could choose, this one young man who was 18 and lived in Centerville, where we have a summer house in Austerville. So I didn't know him, but I knew his parents somewhat cursory. And he said, I know they're interesting, excuse me, but could I do a paper on Whitey Bulger? I said, Whitey Bulger? Well, I'd like to juxtapose Whitey, he used the word juxtapose. I'd like to juxtapose Whitey Bulger to Senator Bulger, like good man, bad man. And I thought, wow, this is an 18-year-old. So he wrote a paper. I got the paper. It was so well done, beautifully typed, grammatically correct, a couple of errors, but it was very good. So I gave him an A. The next year, I had another hockey star, and he wrote the same paper. But he started it off, my Polish immigrant grandmother who lives in Chelsea suggested this to me. And he went on, and I said, you did write this paper? He says, oh, yes. I said, and your Polish grandmother suggested it. So we had a little bit of a discussion, and I said, I pulled out of my briefcase this one paper. I don't know, I kept it for a year. And I gave him a second chance. He wrote a second paper, which I was very happy was not plagiarized. But I think one of the things is with history, you have to have fun with it. Well, I did bring a few books. They're $20, cash or check, and they are beautifully illustrated. So I really appreciate the attention. Thank you for coming.